Hi, everybody. I'm very happy and proud and honored to introduce our next panel, which maybe could be called Yoga, Asanas, Transformations, and Transculturation, because we have two different scholars looking at two different long histories of yoga that intersect actually at the point of one of the manuscripts in the exhibition, the Bar al-Hayat. Both of our speakers are really quite distinguished, and they have incredibly long biographies, and they've published a million things. And so I'm going to just introduce them both together. Speaking first will be James Mallinson, the Sanskritist, although he self-identifies as a philologist, and lecturer in Sanskrit and Classical Studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies, who's translated numerous works on Hatha Yoga in particular and changed our perceptions of the field, but also is responsible for developing, I think, a unique methodology that combines Sanskrit textual analysis and ethnography and art history, really close looking at images to revise our sense of the history of the sectarian development, as well as asana. And the next speaker is Dr. Carl Ernst, the William R. Keenan Jr. Distinguished Professor of Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, a linguist, a specialist in Islamic studies, and particularly like a leader, maybe the creator of this field of where Islam and yoga, yogis and yoginis intersect in both intellectual and practical, on-the-ground kind of arenas, is Carl Ernst. And at the very beginning of this project, I took all of the courage that I had to ask Carl Ernst to join the project. David, it took a lot of courage to call you as well. And so it's great to have you here today. But first, let me have Jim Mallinson come up here.
Okay, can you hear me okay? Yes, it sounds like it's coming out. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Debra, for that extremely generous introduction. And also thank you to Debra and Nancy and everyone else for organizing both the symposium and the show, which I think we'll all agree is fantastic. And also for me, Debra introduced me as a philologist, self-identifying philologist, and also an ethnographer. And the last few years, I've also been informing my work with art historical sources, which has been incredibly useful and enlightening, and particularly so since I've been involved with the exhibition. I feel very, very lucky to have been invited to help out. And I'd also like to thank Debra for initiating me into the world of art history. I would describe myself as a completely colorblind Philistine. So I'm sure, even though she has given me, taught me the basics, I'll probably now make some terrible errors in the way I talk about some of these pictures, but so excuse that. Right. Okay. Yoga today is widely identified with the practice of a multitude of often complex and difficult physical postures, usually carried out in particular sequences. Those modern practitioners who seek to locate their yoga within the Indian tradition call such postures by their Sanskrit name, asanas. Asana is the third component of yoga in its earliest systematization, that found in the Patanjala Yoga Shastra, i.e. Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, and its commentary, or perhaps auto-commentary, the Yoga Bhashya. Most, but not all, subsequent systematizations of yoga also include asana in their lists of yoga's components. Prior to approximately the 10th century CE, however, the asanas of yoga bore little resemblance to the stretches and contortions with which they are now identified. Asana, as implied by the primary meaning of the Sanskrit verbal root from which the word is derived, as, to sit, denoted a seated position adopted by the yogi in order to practice the meditational techniques for controlling the mind, which were the essence of yoga in its early formulations, both those of the classical tradition derived from Patanjali, and those found in tantric works of the first millennium. The Yoga Bhashya names 11 asanas. Most can be identified through commentaries or descriptions in later texts. The first, Padmasana, or the lotus posture, is the most iconic of all yogic postures, found in both the classical and tantric traditions. And it is this posture that we find in our earliest depictions of yogic meditation, such as these statues of the Buddha from Gandhara. This one's from the 2nd century, and the next one is... oh, no, hang on, you jump one. Oh, we've missed one. It doesn't matter. It's Padmasana. The Yoga Bhashya also mentions a Sopasraya asana, a posture with a support, Sa Upasraya, which in subsequent texts is also known as Yoga Partasana. The yogi uses a belt called a Yoga Pata to support himself while sitting in meditation. So we saw the Yoga Bunny earlier, who had her Yoga Pata around her. And we see in this slide, I think if you look at the top right, you can see, and there's a close-up there, of a yogi sitting supported upright with this belt. And this is another depiction of a Yoga Partasana also from Sanchi, so first century BC. And we also find it in many subsequent pictures of yogis up to the early modern period, such as this 17th century painting of a group of Gorakhnati yogis. But unlike the lotus position, its practice appears to have died out today. More complex non-seated asanas first come to the fore with the systematization of physical yogic techniques under the name hatha in texts composed in the 11th to 15th centuries CE. Even then, however, despite their emphasis on bodily techniques, the earlier works of the corpus still describe only seated postures when they teach asana. The first text on hatha yoga to describe non-seated asanas is the 15th century Hatha Pradipika, which teaches 7 such postures. The Hatha Pradipika is for the most part a compilation, and we can trace its descriptions of these postures through a series of earlier Vaishnava tantric works. The earliest description is of Mayurasana, the peacock, and is found in a circa 10th century text called the Vimanarchana Kalpa. This depiction of Mayurasana is found on a wall of the Mahamandir in Jodhpur and dates to approximately 1810 CE. The next non-seated posture to be taught in text is Kukutasana, the cock. And this posture is among the first non-seated hatha yogic asanas to be depicted in painting or statuary, here in this carving on the Prakara wall of the temple of Mallikarjuna at Sri Shailam in Andhra Pradesh, which was completed in 1510 CE, just as the texts of formalized hatha yoga were gaining widespread popularity. Dating to a similar period are these 2 depictions of non-seated asanas from Vijayanagar. You can only just about make that one out, but it seems to be an inverted lotus, so a lotus position in a headstand. But these textual references and artistic depictions are not the earliest Indic evidence of non-seated physical postures being used for religious ends. There are reports of and textual allusions to Indian ascetics holding difficult physical postures from more than 1,000 years earlier. Perhaps the best known are the ascetics encountered by members of Alexander the Great's entourage, Nitakshashila, in the 4th century BC. Naked, they would adopt difficult positions, including standing on one leg, and remain exposed to the burning heat of the sun all day long. We have no contemporaneous depictions of these ascetics, of these practices. The earliest I know of is in the famous 7th century relief at Mahabalipuram, which I think I'm probably the 3rd or 4th person to be showing. I don't think my photographs are quite as good as the others, so sorry about that. So you see here in the top left, the ascetic standing on one leg holding his arms in the air, and then the cat at the bottom right. So indicative of orthodox opposition towards such practices is the depiction lower down on the relief of a cat holding the same pose. Extreme ascetic practices are condemned in the Bhagavad Gita, and in the legal codes of Manu, heretics who practice such prohibited acts are likened to cats. Buddhist and Jain texts from the same period as Alexander's foray into India also mention ascetics performing extreme physical practices. These include standing for long periods, adopting difficult squatting postures, and the vaguli vata. So this is another word, actually, another relatively obscure word for bat. So vaguli is the Pali, and valguli is the Sanskrit for bat. And so vaguli vata means something like the bat penance, or the bat austerity, in which the ascetic hangs upside down from a tree. The latter remained a relatively common ascetic practice until less than 100 years ago. And here we see it in the top middle from a picture from, this is from the collection of the British Museum. Now, the Buddha, of course, dismisses such practices. He tries some physical techniques, but says they're no use. But some of them were used by the Jains. Mahavira, the last Jain Tirthankara, is said to have sat in Utkartikasana, the squatting posture mentioned also in the Buddhist canon, in order to obtain enlightenment. And many of his forerunners were said to have cast off their bodies while in a rigid standing position. This is well represented in iconography, for example, in this 9th century bronze. Despite being beyond the pale of Brahminical orthodoxy, the ascetics of this period who practiced these physical austerities developed, along with the Buddhists and the Jains, many of the principles now identified as central to Hinduism. Their physical practices were a corollary of one of these new doctrines, that of karma. A difficult posture held for a long time worked in two ways. Immobility prevented the production of new karma, while the practice of austerity was thought to burn up karma that had already been accrued. With the elimination of karma, which is what ties us to the wheel of rebirth, the ascetic was liberated. Karma soon became a key tenet of orthodox Brahmanism, as evinced by the Upanishads and Bhagavad Gita. Yet, as I've already noted, the latter text condemns physical austerities, and it took rather longer for the self-mortifying ascetic to be accepted as part of the traditions that came to be known as Hinduism. There are occasional references to physical ascetic practices in the Mahabharata, but it is not until the Puranas of the second half of the first millennium CE that they become a common feature of the austerities undertaken by gods, sages, and kings, who are often said to hold their arms in the air or stand on one leg for long periods. This picture is of Vishwamitra. It's in the British Library. It's from the 17th century, and it depicts him performing austerities as taught in the Ramayana, although in the Ramayana the practices aren't described, so this is a kind of later inference of what he was doing. Now, as part of this process of the acceptance of these techniques, the aim of them became aligned with the ancient Vedic notion of tapas, which we've heard a bit about already, the heating power of self-denial. Through austerities, bolstered by yogic bodily techniques that assisted celibacy, the ascetic could build up a store of power that could then be used to force the vision of the gods or to give blessings and curses. Extreme ascetic practices such as these and others, including sitting under the summer sun surrounded by smouldering fires, as we see in the bottom right of this picture, or spending the winter nights immersed in icy water, again in that pool at the bottom middle of the picture, they are practiced to this day. So here's a picture from the Kumbh Mela in Haridwar in 2010 of a Ramanandi ascetic. But these practices have never been taught in texts. Their details are passed on orally from guru to chela, from teacher to disciple. In fact, the only practices of these ascetics which are taught in texts are those which came to be codified as Hatha Yoga. And this codification came about in order that these more easily practiced ascetic methods might be passed on to a wider non-ascetic audience, like us. The practices of these ascetics were difficult, as indicated by the name given to them, Hatha, and even the more obviously yogic methods worked together with the ascetic techniques as means for the accumulation of ascetic power. On being taught to a wider audience, their purpose was adapted accordingly. The Hatha practices were initially taught as supplementary to classical eightfold yoga, and their ends were brought in line with its meditational focus. Thus, in the early Hatha Yoga texts, asana is still aimed at meditation and breath control, with just occasional statements such as that found in the Vivekamartanda to the effect that asanas remove disease. Meanwhile, other physical practices, such as the Hatha Yogic mudras, which are methods of manipulating the body's vital energies, and complex methods of inhalation and exhalation, are said to have more precise therapeutic benefits. Over time, all practices which involved physical postures came to be subsumed under the rubric of asana. Thus, the bat penance mentioned by the Buddha resurfaces in an 18th century Braj Bhasha manual of Hatha Yoga called the Jog Pradipaka as Tapkar Asana, the ascetic's posture. And the corpse pose, which is first taught in the 13th century Dattatreya Yoga Shastra as a sanketa or secret method of Laya Yoga, the meditational yoga of dissolution, becomes, 2 centuries later in the Hatha Pradipaka, an asana to remove fatigue and calm the mind. The process of including all physical postures under the rubric of asana continues to this day. The standing poses that distinguish modern transnational yoga from its pre-modern forerunners are also called asanas, complete with Sanskrit names not found in pre-modern texts, such as Trikonasana, the triangle pose, or, for the now iconic downward dog, Adho Mukha Svanasana. And modern yoga has turned the Hatha yogic inversion, a mudra called Viparita Karani, whose purpose was to use gravity to keep the life force in the head, into Shirshasana, the headstand. As textual descriptions of asanas became more extensive, they started to include more detailed information on specific therapeutic benefits. Thus, for example, the Jog Pradipaka's Chakri asana is said to cure afflictions of the stomach. Traditional yogic asanas can thus be understood as having 4 possible aims: to provide a firm and comfortable position in which to meditate, to cultivate tapas, or the power of asceticism, to control the vital energies, variously understood as the breath, kundalini, or bindu, semen, or in women, rajas, uterine fluid, which we just heard a bit about, and finally, to provide physical therapeutic benefits. These aims are all found in descriptions of asanas in the Hatha yogic canon and are not mutually exclusive. Nevertheless, traditional Hatha yoga is best understood as the result of the coming together of 2 traditions, and to a certain extent these traditions have remained distinct despite the blending of many of their practices. The older tradition is that of the ascetics I have been discussing. Onto their physical practices were overlaid the visualization-based techniques of the tantric tradition associated with the Gorakhnati yogis, within whose earlier lineages were developed the well-known features of the yogic subtle body, such as kundalini and the chakras, here depicted in the picture that's in the exhibition from Jodhpur, which illustrates a manuscript of the Siddha Siddhanta Paddhati, a classic Gorakhnati text. The earliest paintings of yogic asanas are illustrations of a manuscript of a Persian text on yoga, the Bar al-Khayat, 10 pictures from which are on show in the exhibition and about which Professor Karl Ernst will shortly be talking. This text's teachings are closely connected with those of the Gorakhnati tradition, and its yogic postures are seated postures for meditation rather than the non-seated postures associated with the ascetic tradition. As the exception to prove this rule, the text which accompanies the one painting in the manuscript to show a non-seated pose, this depiction of an inversion, clearly states that the yogi is to assume siddhasana, a well-known seated posture. One wonders whether the artist's model, whose accoutrements show that unlike the others in the album, he was not a Gorakhnati, was keen to show off his practice of more gymnastic asanas. The texts of Hatha Yoga were composed to teach its practices to householders and make only fleeting allusions to its connection with asceticism, but that connection persisted and persists to this day within the living ascetic traditions. Singularly illuminating is the case of Puran Puri, a picture of whom is included in Bob Del Bonte's fantastic Strange and Wondrous exhibition, and which I believe he's going to be talking about tomorrow. Last year, whilst preparing a paper on this amazing ascetic, thanks to Google Books, I made a chance discovery of a translation of his own account of his life story, published anonymously in the European magazine in 1810. Sometime in the middle of the 18th century, Puran Puri decided that he wanted to undertake an austerity. As is clear from the pictures of him, he chose the Urdhva Bahu, or arms in the air penance. In his story, however, he also lists the 18 tapasyas, or austerities, that his teachers told him he could choose from. And this is from the PDF of the magazine that I found on Google. Now, in this list of 18, nowhere does he mention yoga, but several of these tapasyas are what would commonly be understood as yogic techniques rather than austerities. Number 8 is particularly noteworthy. It's Chaudasi Asan, which is still the common Hindi term for the 84 asanas of yoga. And it's said in the translation of Puran Puri's words to be different postures in sitting, such as continuing several hours with the feet on the neck or under the arms, after which the members are returned to their normal positions. As I mentioned before, the practices of these ascetics are never taught in texts, and so this apparently canonical, if one can use such a word for something transmitted orally, this apparently canonical list of the 18 austerities provides us with a unique window onto ascetic practice. Okay, almost there. Indeed, it was thanks to this list that we have been able to identify what this ascetic, whose picture appears in the exhibition, is doing. He is undertaking the Akasha Muni penance, described as fixing one's regard towards heaven and never looking down towards the earth. Puran Puri is also an excellent example of the paradoxically empowering nature of Indian asceticism, which, even when it mortifies the body, is understood as bestowing great physical power. Far from being cowed by the monumental austerity he undertook, Puran Puri went from strength to strength, travelling for most of the second half of the 18th century. And as I'm running out of time, I will whiz you through his tour. But so with both arms in the air, he was travelling for probably 30 years or so. And he started at this Kumbh Mela. So you see the arrows start in Allahabad. And headed south. He got across to Malaysia, didn't hang around there, didn't like it very much. Back all the way up through what's now Pakistan, Afghanistan, round the Caspian, all the way up to Moscow. He wanted to go to England, in fact. He thought the English are coming to my country, I'm going to go and have a look at theirs. But when he got to Moscow, he generated such enormous crowds that he decided it would be impossible to continue, so he turned back. He didn't go straight home, though. He took in a bit of Arabia and up through there and over in Tibet, spent a lot of time in Nepal, and eventually ended up in Lhasa for a while and then down to Calcutta, where he did a spy mission. He conveyed some information from the Tashi Lama to Warren Hastings in Calcutta. That's just a short, so I recommend the story. It's absolutely fantastic. There's loads more in there. Okay. So the fixedness of the austerities in Puran Puri's list is illustrative of a key difference between pre-modern and modern yoga. In pre-modern yoga, motionless is key to postural practice. While as can be seen in yoga studios throughout the world, modern yoga often involves flowing sequences, flying in the face of the implication of sedentariness of the word asana. Indeed, one of the first Sanskrit texts to teach repetitive motions as part of yoga calls such practices charanas as opposed to asanas. It is within the ascetic tradition of Hatha Yoga that the practice of non-seated asanas has persisted. Thus, some Ramanandi Tyagis perform Hatha Yogic asanas at the end of their dhuni tap, their fire austerity. Just whiz through a few pictures of. Said to be quite dangerous. Some of the sort of inverted postures, people fall over and burn themselves. Okay, now I'll just go back there. Historical evidence for the ascetics of the other yogi tradition, that of the Gorakhnati yogis, practicing non-seated asanas, is almost non-existent. And those, like me, who have sought out asana practicing Gorakhnatis have been frustrated, until recently. At this year's Kumbh Mela festival, the triennial gathering of all India's ascetics, Gorakhnati yogis were performing displays of asanas at the front of their camp. And so there was this chap, Anupnath Yogi. And it appears that they are seeking to capitalize on the popularity of yoga in India and abroad by refashioning their yogic heritage. Furthermore, not only are they practicing traditional ascetic postures, such as this one, so the one he's got here is also depicted in a picture from 1820 from a text called the Tashri al-Aqwam, and in that it's this the ascetic here is said to have kept a vow of silence for 15 years. He's a Paramahansa, so he's a proper ascetic. But they are also practicing the standing poses that set modern yoga apart from traditional asana practice and are likely to derive from military drills, perhaps not this one, but the general principle of these standing poses, bodybuilding and gymnastics. Now, so here we have Agehananda Bharati's pizza effect at work, in which, like pizza, yoga has gone abroad, mutated, and returned home in its new form. So even at its traditional core, yoga remains in transformation. Thank you very much.